Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Happy Wednesday.
Welcome, everybody, to a waning day of a beautiful, beautiful fall, brisk, pre-winter day. It's really nice to welcome all of you to this really special presentation this evening. We'll wait a few minutes to make sure everybody's here who wants to be here, and then we'll get going.
Well, as a social scientist, I'm excited about the shift to kind of the social science angle that we're moving into these next couple of weeks.
And I, sort of as a global educator, I'm very excited that we're going to put a lot of the, place the COVID-19 pandemic in a global context and understand how pivotal it is for, well, I'm assuming that some collaboration is necessary in order to overcome this phenomenon that's taken over our lives. So I'm very much looking forward to the talk today. We'll give it about 30 more seconds and we'll get started to officially welcome you, Ami. Okay. So as we were saying, we're very much looking forward to this evening's lecture as it places the COVID-19 pandemic in a global context and considers questions like, what is the role of global cooperation, particularly through the World Health Organization, in responding to COVID-19? And also explores the possibilities and complications that arise through global cooperation, or in this case, non-cooperation, in times of crisis, especially when we take into consideration global inequities. For this task, it's truly a pleasure to welcome Dr. Ami Shah, Associate Professor of Global Studies and Anthropology at PLU. Dr. Shah's current research focus is on representation of the developing world in the humanitarian industry and decolonial approaches to international studies and pedagogy. Previously, Dr. Shah conducted research on urban change and identity in Nigeria and India. At PLU, she teaches courses focused on contemporary global issues, global development and international relations for global studies, anthropology, political science, and the International Honors Program, a true interdisciplinary scholar. The title of Dr. Shah's lecture this evening is Cooperating to Control COVID, Global Governance and the Role of the World Health Organization. Welcome, Ami.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you, Teresa. It's great to see everyone, as it were. I've been on sabbatical, so this is kind of a first time to kind of see a lot of students and some of my colleagues. It's great to have you here. I'm going to go ahead and start. Again, I'm in global studies and in anthropology, but my work is really focused in international development or global development. And in this process, I'm really concerned about how the world can work together in order to improve the lot of everyone, right? So this is a field in development studies that you get involved in because you have some hope, because you hope for the world to be a better place somehow. In my own role, I work on how development is actually received by the people who are supposedly impoverished and supposedly worse off. I say supposedly because it all depends on our framing. I also think it's really important right now with the variety of misinformation that we have to kind of step back and think about what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about international organizations. We're at a moment where we're so focused, and in many ways rightfully so, on what's happening within our own borders that it's sometimes hard to step back and really see what's happening in the world around us and how we might need to connect. So I hope this helps to do that in some ways. But I want to start by really reflecting on our contemporary context. Like I said, we're at a point where we're really focused, especially here in the United States, right? What's happening within our borders. And as I was kind of thinking about this idea of hoping for a better world, I stopped to think about 2020, right? And we've all heard this, we've all thought about this. It's unprecedented times. If you're like me, if somebody says we are in an unprecedented age, one more time, I might throw my computer out the window. But we also have all the jokes about 2020 and waiting for 2020 to be over. And as I was thinking, these were just words that kind of came to the top of my head that define our moment in less than a second. And if I just jotted these down, and these are all things that are weighing heavy on us right now. And I say this because as I thought about, well, what do I do? And this desire of hoping for a better world, it was really hard for me to think about hope right now. Hope has been something that's been kind of diminished in my own psyche. And it's also been something, if I can be really vulnerable for a moment, that my oldest, my 4-year-old, has been showing me how to hold tight. And the most recent thing was lockdown started a few months before her birthday this year. And she, of course, didn't get to have her birthday party, etc. And she handled it in stride. And she started over the weekend planning for her birthday party next year with hope that the virus will be over, but also kind of hedging that hope about, well, if it isn't over, maybe we can do this on Zoom, which, you know, is also kind of weird to think about for a 4-year-old. But it did make me think about, what does hope mean right now? So take a second maybe and use the chat function and think about, what is one thing that you're hopeful for in regards to this pandemic? Oops, sorry. Give it maybe 30 more seconds or so. Yeah, so there's a lot here about just for it to be over, right? That's maybe one of our biggest desires, is for this to just be over, an idea to move on. I see a lot about like empathy, or thinking more about connections with others, whether it be in person or physically, but also a desire to move on to something else, to be able to focus on something else too. I saw some for uh, vaccines, changes regarding working from home, um, greater internet access, right? Uh, all of that. Seeing students in person again, I definitely am hoping for that. So the thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind through this is, in order for your hope to be achieved, what is needed? And we can think about what is needed of us, what is needed of our community, but what is needed of the larger world around us. So hopefully that kind of continues to pull through throughout my session today. The kind of probably more focus point is to think about our course content then, right? We're halfway through the semester. There's 5 sessions after this one. And it's a good point to kind of stop and to think about where we've been and where we're going, if you will. I use a lot of roadmap metaphors, so I'll just throw that out there. They just come out. So we started really with our biologists thinking about the science of the virus, and also the science of vaccine creation. What is needed for this virus to spread? What is needed for it to stop? We then moved into our colleagues from the humanities, who've covered so much, right? So this is just a very, very brief list, but we've thought about, from Dr. Eisen, the importance of understanding others and other contexts on their own terms, right? Really the importance of being able to step into other people's shoes. We've thought about plagues in history, the medical humanities and different religious responses, the impacts of colonialism on a variety of indigenous communities. We've thought about the importance of art and artistic representations. We've learned here, as we talked about Native Indigenous communities, about social determinants of health, ideas of rights and responsibilities. The idea that America is very much a rights-based society as opposed to a responsibilities-based society, and the ethics, especially the ethics of our own actions within this. I'm kind of sneaking in here as this first social science transition. And I say sneaking in because I'm going to really focus on the global part of it before we kind of turn back to individuals and also kind of domestic region or domestic arena. So I really want to think big picture here. We could talk about what's needed within our own community, but also what the larger system, what the global system needs to do in order to respond to pandemics. And the good thing is we've done this before, right? There's actually a lot of lessons to be learned and things that we can use. The part that gets kind of lost is that all of this is obviously political, right? Access to healthcare is political, it's about power. So the ideas of who gets care, how we cooperate, who has say in what cooperation looks like. That's all about power politics. And sometimes we forget that because we're so focused on like, well, the science is this, right? And so part of what we have to remember is that you have to actually engage in the politics, as horrible as sometimes it feels, in order to kind of make some of these transitions happen. And finally, after today, we're going to look ahead to the psychologies of non-compliance, the importance of social media and social media disinformation, the limits of historical analogies, theater and telling the story of the pandemic. And finally, in our final session, we'll go back to humanities and look at ideas of hope. So again, we'll try to connect through this. And I want you to pause for a moment and just think about the connections that you've already kind of made from the first 6 weeks of this course. I know a lot of you who are taking this for credit have been writing about that as well, but keep them in the back of your mind. There's no need to share right now, but just take a second to think about where you've been and what kind of threads or common threads you've seen throughout. All right, so as Dr. Williams said, today I'm going to focus on this central question. What is the role of global cooperation, particularly through the World Health Organization, WHO, in responding to COVID-19? And I'm going to break my lecture into 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to do the conceptual framework. So the introduced concepts regarding global governance and cooperation. And this will be hopefully the heaviest part in terms of the most information and maybe the things that are the newest for you. I say this knowing that I think some of our Global Studies International Affairs alumni are here and have probably, hopefully this is old hat to you. And I'm realizing I'm saying hopefully all the time to you, so it must really be in my head. The second part of the lecture is to look at the kind of practicalities, the nuts and bolts. What is the WHO? What has it done in its varied responses? And what is its response to COVID-19? What is it actually doing? And then finally, I want to think about the possibilities and complications that arise through global cooperation, especially in times of crisis. I want to move back to my kind of development studies hat and think about how does this interact with global inequalities and how does it serve the world in a more holistic and interactive way. So again, I'm going to start really focusing on the international affairs or international relations part of this. And this is something that here in the United States, at least, we talk about foreign policy and international relations kind of in sound bites, and we don't necessarily stop to think about what's actually included. Another way to think about it is if you've watched any of the presidential or vice presidential debates, how often has like foreign policy come up? Very, very, very rarely. So take a second. And here again, I would love for you to share this. What do you understand international relations to be? So if I say we're going to talk about international relations, what do you think we're going to talk about? And yeah, there's no right answer here. We'll take maybe 30 more seconds. Okay, yeah, so there's a lot of clues here, right? Obviously, the title of my lecture includes the idea of cooperation, so global cooperation is definitely involved. There's also a lot, right, just within international relations. It tells you a bit of what it is, really focusing on the relationship between states. That's a little bit of an older formulation. Now, when we talk about international relations, a lot of people are instead talking about global politics or world politics, because we're not just thinking about relationships between states. And when I say state here, I don't mean like Wyoming and Idaho. I mean like the United States and Russia, right? So countries would be the other word. States is the word that we would use in the social sciences to talk about countries. And then so we're thinking about states, but we're also thinking about multinational corporations. We're thinking about international organizations like WHO. We're thinking about activist groups like Oxfam, or we're also thinking about like terrorist groups, right? Like these big transnational actors. So when we're studying international relations, we're studying all of these types of interactions. But in this, there's different kind of ways that we could approach international relations. So I saw a lot of people talk about war and trade and business, right? So these are different kind of subfields, if you will. Security studies, which would be where you'd study war, trade or international economics. There's everything from that to like green politics, et cetera. There's just so much in terms of different kind of subfields of international relations. At PLU, our focus on international relations starts kind of at the entry point, which is around theory. Right? So I know I say theory, and a lot of times we get a little bit scared, but the theoretical part of international relations is a cool way to think about why do states and why do other actors act in particular ways? Why do they choose to cooperate or choose not to? We're trying to kind of look at patterns and look at explanations that can be generalized a bit more. And that serve not just a lens for understanding the world, but also serve as a lens through which we see the world, right? So one thing that you could ask yourselves, and again, you don't need to share this, right, is that do you just now, without me even starting, think that cooperation internationally is a good or bad thing? You already have an international relations theory in your head just by answering that question. So just know that we all have them, even if we haven't been able to identify or articulate them yet. I also want to emphasize that international relations as a field of academic study is really, really new. It's 101 years old, if I'm going to be very precise. So the first kind of chair or appointment to teach international relations was in 1919 at Aberystwyth University in Wales. The United States had a similar timeline at Georgetown University in 1919, and then in the 1920s it expanded. It's not a surprising time, right? It's the end of World War I, where you suddenly have this interest in how we make this current world system work. And that's the kind of second important part. So first is that it's new. Second is that it's really focused on a very particular historical moment. When we're talking about relationships between states, when we're talking about power relations, yes, there's a beginning of this that starts in the 15 or 1600s, depending on who you ask, as we start to see entities, political entities, break away from the church and other kind of larger groupings and form their own individual states. However, it really takes until the mid-20th century, maybe even later, the late 20th century, for this system and these states that you see here to solidify. So for example, if you look at Africa and if you look at Asia on this map, most of these states did not exist as states until between 1960 and 1975, when they became independent from their colonial rulers. So it's a very, very new current system. Now, historically, we can go back and draw from other texts. We often draw from the classical Western texts of Rome and Greece. We could go back to other places too. There's kind of some phenomenal Chinese and Indian texts about how states interact in war, etc. So there's some kind of going back and creating this lineage to draw on. But when we start to focus on what we're actually explaining, we're explaining a very contemporary system. And that's just really important to note, that it can't explain everything, right? It's very, very specific. But the cool thing about international relations, so the third thing I'm going to add, is that it's always changing, in part because it's new and in part because the world's always changing. And that's, for me, it's a really dynamic field and something that's really exciting to participate in, because you really just get to strive to understand the world as it's happening. And that's really what we're seeing right now with COVID-19 and with a variety of state responses, including the United States. So that said, the theory that I'm going to focus on here is liberalism. This is the one that really talks the most about cooperation. And you can see from the little symbols I have at the bottom, liberalism is a theory that's really solidified in the interwar years, that is between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II, and then the institution creation really happens post-World War II. And it starts with the League of Nations in 1919. This is Woodrow Wilson's idea to create a League of Nations that cooperates to provide safety and security for the world at large. It's really thought of as a security organization at the time. It was a colossal failure. The easiest way to explain how big of a failure it was is that the United States proposed it and the United States did not even join it. So everything went back to the drawing board. The League of Nations failed, and then the Great Depression happened and World War II happened. And states started to cooperate more towards the end of World War II in an effort to prevent both the type of conflict again, and secondly, the type of economic downturn. So to look at this a little bit more, liberalism as a theory is concerned with morality, right? Doing what's right. It's concerned with rationality, making decisions based on a full kind of accounting of what the ultimate good or ultimate outcomes might be, and the idea of human good, right? And so it draws from philosophy and ideas that humans are inherently good and can cooperate with each other, and takes that to the international scale. Now, this is really important because we often talk in international relations about like rogue states and bad states and evil states and the axis of evil, etc. And this says that actually there's huge incentive for states to act well, right? And for there to be good in our actions, and we need to figure out how to encourage that. The other part of liberalism is that it becomes really, really popular in the search for international governance. So it's kind of this really weird historical point where post-World War II, we're really searching for there to be more stability through global governance or international governance, and then simultaneously kind of withdrawing in the midst of the Cold War. So we start to pick and choose as the United States, really like what aspects of international governance we're going to participate in more or not. And so the institutions that come out are really first and foremost the United Nations. The United Nations is often thought of as this like vast General Assembly where people go to talk, or states go to talk, and nothing really ever gets done. Now, the General Assembly might see that, but the United Nations also has a ton of different agencies that do a lot of work and that are really based around the idea of cooperation. So I just want to highlight that. This is everything from the World Trade Organization to the World Bank to the International Court of Justice, the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, UN Women. There's so many different organizations that do a lot of work, and it's not just the kind of big political spectacle that we often think of when we think of the UN. So that's the first. And like I said, the League of Nations was really thought to be kind of a security organization, but because of the Cold War, it fell apart as that, and that's when it started to get more engaged in issues of development and culture, like UNICEF and all of that. So it really had its kind of a remit transition. Then collective security organizations emerged, right? So NATO became the alternative to the United Nations for the United States and for Western powers. So it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that was set up after World War II. So, right, a collective security organization is essentially an all for one and one for all. Yeah, it's this idea that an attack against one is an attack against all, and we will work together to protect each other. It's a way to pool resources and to try to stabilize small powers to prevent a small kind of conflict just expanding into a large war. Of course, right, the United States and others feel like they can't do this within the United Nations anymore, especially because the Soviet Union was a big player in the United Nations. So they switch and make their own organization. These are the first two. There's a huge amount of organizations that kind of come out afterward. The third really important part of this, though, is the focus on democratization. Right, and this, of course, again, is like a Cold War goal to prevent the spread of communism from the Soviet Union. But it's also this idea that if states act well at home, and if they follow rules and allow for the voice of their citizenry, then they're going to act well internationally as well. And to kind of link to some of the other things you've heard about, this is a big theory that comes from the philosopher Immanuel Kant as well, this idea of a separate peace or perpetual peace that can exist between nations that really hold this idea of democracy and voice dear. That's a very, very quick simplification of Kantian theory of democracy, but hopefully it suffices for now. So liberalism makes four kind of key claims about how the world works. I'm going to give you some big ideas, and then we'll talk about the four specific claims, right? So again, they're all about how to get states to act their best. And one way to do that is to think about global governance. So states act their best when there is morality and law. When there's things to follow and when we're really not just looking out for ourselves, but looking out to do what's best. Secondly, they can use reason and rationality to justify cooperation. And through cooperation, you can achieve mutual goals, especially peace. So they see this happening, this achievement of mutual goals and this idea of law and world governance through four kind of key claims, or four key tenets, if you will. The first is that democratic values matter, right? So again, if you act well at home, then you're going to act well outside. Ideas like having representative democracy means that the citizenry is not going to want to go to war, for example. It also means that you uphold particular values and you use those values when you engage with other states. The second is what we'd call economic liberalism or free trade. Right, so we try to allow trade to flourish and economies to flourish and interact. And the idea, again, is that as our economies interact, we become increasingly interconnected and thus much less likely to attack each other, to go to war. I'm realizing that I should take a moment, I meant to do this earlier, and say that when I'm talking about liberalism, you need to pick up ideas in the United States of what is conservative and what is liberal, especially in the context of elections, and just push them aside. Here we're talking about a philosophical idea or a theoretical idea of liberalism that's really based around individual freedoms and mutual cooperation. So think, right, Bill of Rights or the French Revolution, as opposed to thinking about Democrats or Republicans. I know it's hard, especially right now, but just try to do that. All right, so those are the first two, right? We have political liberalism at home and economic liberalism at home that's supposed to affect how we interact. But then when we get to interaction, again, we want law and we want mutual cooperation, right? So teamwork makes the dream work, as my 4-year-old says. The idea here is that if we work together, we can achieve larger goals that are good for both of us, right? So it's like saying that state A and state B can both try to make cars on their own, but that's a lot of like just startup, right? So let's say state A makes tires and state B makes engines. If you trade and work together, you're going to have less startup, less work in that, and you're both going to benefit from it. That's a very simple trade example, but there's other examples when you think about how cooperation is really necessary in order to achieve something more than you could achieve on your own. The other idea is that rules are not just about setting kind of standards, but if you don't follow the rules, bad things happen, right? That there's actually a huge incentive to follow rules in international cooperation and in international society, because then it becomes more predictable. It means there's a lesser chance of conflict. It means there's standards through which disputes can be articulated and gone through. It means that people are safer, right? And thus hopefully happier and healthier. So, and thinking about liberalism, I thought it was just like a perfect metaphor for the response that we're having to the pandemic. Well, maybe a lot of you have seen the kind of mask up Washington ads or all do your part. You've seen the PLU emails, we're all in this together, lyrics, or the idea of the shield, right? For some reason, when we're talking about immigration, when we talk about disease, and when we talk about natural disasters, we like to use war metaphors. So you can see here, we've like co-opted Rosie the Riveter in order to think about what our response to COVID can be. We have this idea of victory begins at home, and that it's for all of us, or we're doing our part, right? You even have some Avengers sneaking in some of the ads I've seen. And right, this is really interesting to me because we have all of this messaging in the United States, but especially Washington, not everywhere in the United States, about how we all need to do our part, right? How cooperation is necessary. And we don't necessarily see that same thing on the global level. But before I move to that, I would like you to just stop and think about what kinds of cooperation are really like helpful. And it doesn't have to be in the international sphere, but what things in life are just better when you cooperate or work with someone else. It can be one other person, it can be a large group, whatever. In what ways does cooperation really help? And again, this can be super broad. So yeah, go ahead and use the chat. And you can think about cooperation, mutual gains. You can think about having rules and regulations. Parenting, oh yes. I see one thinking about cleaning up. So to connect that to parenting, right? We have those of you who have toddlers in the Tacoma area are likely to know the song Clean Up. Everybody do your share. Yeah. Lifting heavy furniture, right? A lot of physical tasks. Yeah, advancing knowledge. A sports team, yes. So I'll just throw this in there. One of the things I often talk about in my intro to international relations class is what would happen if we thought about international affairs as a sports league. I usually use the NFL because there's a lot of examples of both rule following and not and breaking rules in the NFL. But you can kind of think about the NFL as the kind of organizing, governing body of all these different teams or all these different states, right? And that if they all played by different rules, then it's ridiculously unfair. Okay? So sometimes cooperation is necessary to maintain fairness. Solving puzzles, yeah. Okay, so we have some ideas. I'd like you to also think about those hopes you had at the beginning. And again, could you achieve those hopes on your own, or would you need some cooperation to achieve them? So before I go on to part two, I'm just going to recap liberalism really quickly. And the first is that states should seek absolute gains. Now, I know I didn't use this terminology to start with. I'm going to put it in this terminology now, right? So other theories kind of really focus on each state for themselves, that you should just go out there and do whatever's right for you and not really worry about cooperation. You can't really trust other states. So you should just do whatever is good for your state. And all that matters is that you're just a little bit ahead of another state. It doesn't matter that you're like completely both states are doing well. You always want to be doing better than another state. A great way to think about this is through the Cold War arms race, right? Like we had thousands and thousands and thousands of nuclear warheads that were never going to be used. In fact, we've dismantled most of them. And here I say we being the United States, but also the Soviet Union. And it was really all about one-upmanship, right? So, oh, they've got 100 new warheads that can go this far. I'm going to have 103, and thus I'm more secure somehow. And it just goes back and forth, and it's all really thinking about small relative gains, right? So in relation to the Soviet Union, we have this many more missiles, and thus we're more safe. Here, liberalism says, stop thinking just about yourself and about relative gains. Think about the overall good, both for yourself, but also that the overall good can be mutual, right? So if I gain $10 and Teresa and Tamara each gain $10 too, that's all good. I shouldn't worry about, oh, we're all equal, right? It's better if we're all doing well and we're achieving the most that we can achieve. I hope that makes sense. If there's any questions, please don't hesitate to use the chat to stop me, and maybe one of my co-panelists will stop me if I need to. However, right, it argues that we can't just leave states to themselves. We need to create some sort of framework or institutions, things beyond states, to help cooperation happen. So this is important, again, right, that we're not just thinking about states and how the international system or the global system works, but we're thinking about all sorts of other entities. So you can cooperate for absolute or mutual gains through these institutions. But again, not following the rules is the biggest threat. This is when things go bad. So institutions become really, really important. And there's thus many actors. So I've been talking about international organizations because we're going to talk about the World Health Organization, but there's all sorts of others, right? International NGOs like Amnesty, international law, multinational corporations. I said earlier, transnational terrorist networks are also part of this, right? I know that's a different type of cooperation, but it does spur state behavior in very different ways. So we're going to focus on international organizations and the idea of global governance, right? So how states and other entities work together to shape the boundaries of the international system. You can think of global governance as the rule setting, right? And then international organizations or institutions or organizations that have at least 3 member states. This is important. The international organizations are made up of states. So states become their members. You can think about when you get a library card, you become a member of that library and you have your own card. But I, unfortunately, cannot get a card to be a member of the United Nations. I have to be a state in order to get that card. And this is important because it means that even though we have these institutions to kind of do international governance, at the end of the day, they're also controlled by states. And that's really important to remember when we think about how the World Health Organization works. So this takes me to part 2, right? Who is the who? What do they do? So again, take a moment. I know some of you have probably done the reading. Some of you might not have had a chance because it is what it is right now in the semester. So take a moment and think about what you know about the World Health Organization. And go ahead and, again, use the chat to share with us what you know about it. And if you don't know, you can go ahead and share that too. That Trump doesn't like it. That's a UN agency, the eradication of smallpox. It's founded by the UN, helps organize global response. Yep, works on international health. Great. Yeah, awesome. We're going to talk about all of these things, right? And yeah, the first one was that Trump doesn't like this, which is kind of the impetus for thinking about, well, what do we actually know about the World Health Organization? How can we as citizens be informed? Well, for those of us who are US citizens, be informed when we make decisions based on foreign policy and how our relationships work with other states. So the World Health Organization, as you've already mentioned, is an agency of the United Nations that's focused on international health. The US is actually one of the main contributors to the beginning of the World Health Organization. It was first thought up of in 1946, and the idea of the World Health Organization was created then, and then it was established in 1948. So it's one of the oldest UN agencies, actually. And initially it was kind of focused really specifically on like maternal health, et cetera. But over time, again, the remit has really, really expanded as we dealt with other health emergencies. It has 194 member states. Somebody said 192, so you're right there, right close. And it does a variety of different things. One of the things it does is that it partners with other initiatives. So for example, it partners a lot with the Bill and Melinda Gates Fund, which is probably the biggest global health organization right now, in terms of like vaccine development, et cetera. It also partners with other initiatives like Gavi that are about vaccine creation, with other health initiatives by smaller NGOs too, so it can support those. It does research. It provides support to different countries, and it monitors trends, sees what health trends are happening, and it sets norms. Now, this norm part is really important, right? It sets standards for what is the base level for health initiatives, how should we interact with other countries, what types of drugs and safety standards should we have, et cetera. So this idea of norm setting is kind of vague, right? These are just values that we hold, but they're also really important in both making sure that things are safe, but also in making sure that things are equitable across states. So in short, right, it does information and it has organization. This is really important. It is not an enforcement agency. So again, politics matters. It has to be able to play nice with states in order to get the important information that it needs, and thus in order to be able to organize an appropriate response. A lot of people, Professor Paul Post he's at U Chicago, has talked about how in relation to China, which is one of the reasons that Trump is exceptionally mad with the World Health Organization, it thinks that it deferred to China too much. In relationship to China, they had to both maintain access, right? So they needed to play nice so they could still maintain access, but they needed to be harsh enough in order to get the type of accurate information that they needed. So it's this constant game, and they do not have any enforcement mechanisms. I see a question about what is the role of regional WHO offices. That's a fantastic question, and I'm going to answer it in a fairly unsatisfactory way, that it's kind of up in the air right now. They're trying to rework the organization between the main kind of headquarters in Switzerland and the regional WHO offices. But in part, they're trying to do so in order to make kind of more standardized ways for interacting and quicker community health responses that are localized. So it's trying to do both things, to have kind of more of a standardized approach, if you will, standards that need to be met that are more equal, but then simultaneously allowing for quicker responses that work more strongly with community health organizations. And that's something that really comes out of the Ebola response. And in one of the resources I sent to Tamara and Teresa to be on the resources page, there's a document about reforms post-Ebola, and it's kind of one of the suggestions in there as well. So yeah, the World Health Organization is in this double-edged kind of bind where it has to be somewhat harsh, but it also has to play nice. So that's kind of one of its restrictions. The second one of its restrictions is the budget. Its budget on different years has varied, usually somewhere between 4 and 6 billion. So in 2018 to 2019, it was 6.27 billion. I want to take a moment and put that in context really quickly, that that's the amount of money that Americans spent online on Black Friday. So not in person, not like going to the store or whatever. That is the amount that we spent online on Black Friday last year. And the US military budget is usually somewhere around 650 billion. That just gives you a sense of scale. 20% of its budget comes from Jews that are annually assessed, and the rest is voluntary. This creates the kind of second problem. So again, the first problem is that it has no enforcement mechanism, it has no teeth, unless it's kind of up to the member states themselves and the politics themselves to say what the organization can do. The second problem is that when its budget is so constrained that the voluntary donations are often earmarked. And that means that they can't take those donations and respond to a new crisis through them. So if the voluntary donations are earmarked to be for polio eradication, that's all they can do with them. Donations come from member states and other member organizations like the Bill and Gates Fund. So again, I'm just going to emphasize that it provides non-binding guidance. And again, that's all about power politics. So just to look very quickly at the budget, this red line here is the voluntary contributions, and the blue line here is the assessed contributions, that is the ones that are kind of dues, and this green line is the total. So what you can see from 2000 onwards is that the percentage of voluntary contributions took off, while the percentage of assessed contributions stayed very low, which means there's, again, very, very limited scope for the World Health Organization to do things. It also means that there's kind of this perverse incentive, right? So we're nearing kind of the end of several polio eradication schemes, and it means that there's all this money and all this stuff and all this buildup of knowledge around polio, but that's probably not going to be there in 5 or 10 years, and the WHO is going to shrink again. So this is something that I always talk about in my humanitarianism class. If you're going to donate, it's always great not to earmark funds, because when you earmark them, it makes it hard to respond to new crises. All right, and this is just looking at the US contributions. You can see how they fluctuate over time, but the US is the biggest contributor, but most of it is voluntary. So again, it's not really contributing to the ability, for example, to respond to COVID. So what is WHO's record? So the WHO came probably under its most damning critique by a whole host of experts around the world in response to the 2014 Ebola crisis. So again, that particular one that started in West Africa, that especially affected the countries of Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, spread a little bit regionally and a little bit globally, but was really, really focused as a epidemic in those countries. And part of what happened is in April of that year was when, in 2014, was when the crisis was getting really, really deep. And the World Health Organization waited until the fall to declare an emergency. And then when they declared an emergency, it was a very top-down kind of people coming in from outside, taking over the response, and really ignored community health responses and cultural responses as well. So there was a lot of failures there, and there was a lot of accusations of kind of power politics and race. So this is another important thing to think about, is who gets responded to when. If the World Health Organization is run by member states and it's power politics, it's really hard to shift focus to states that might not be as powerful. This is just one of the resources that I referenced earlier, and that's in the resource collection, or will be soon, about responses coming from the Ebola epidemic. However, the World Health Organization has also done amazing things. This is from its May 1980 kind of newsletter or magazine. It declares smallpox is dead. And I'll just very quickly give you a nice little PLU connection. My Bill Frege is a PLU alum who then went on to head the CDC and is really basically credited with the eradication of smallpox. So the World Health Organization has had a varied kind of response to different things, to different types of outbreaks. But the important part maybe to remember is that it's controlled, right, by member states, so it can only do as much as the member states really allow it to do. And secondly, that it's constantly reforming itself. So there is kind of that response happening. So to quickly talk about its role in COVID-19, it's doing all the things that you guys already mentioned, right? It's monitoring, it's providing general guidance, it's providing essential supplies. This is especially to states with fewer resources. It's providing PPE, et cetera. But in terms of cooperation, it's really participating in vaccine creation in two different ways. So there's the COVID Vaccines Global Alliance, or COVAX, which has about 180 countries or so participating in it, that's trying to think about globally creating a vaccine and supporting that, but also supporting equitable distribution. Then secondly, there's the Coronavirus Technology Access Pool, and this is trying to essentially open up knowledge about vaccine and its responses. So to open up scientific knowledge as opposed to holding it tight, and focusing on patenting it and kind of profiting off of it, but to think rather about the human scope of it. These are two things that the United States has said that it will not participate in. So this brings me to the last bit. I'm going to cover this very quickly because this is something that I really want us to reflect on and maybe have questions on afterwards or use the chat to discuss. Is that what can cooperation do? So these are figures from today. They were taken about 8 a.m. our time that look at cases around the world. So the dark blue are where the greatest number of cases are. But you can see worldwide, we've had almost 44 million cases as of this morning and over 1 million deaths, right? This is nothing short of a massive tragedy. Then when we look at deaths, and you can see I shifted this to look at the United States deaths, there have been over 8 million confirmed cases in this country with over 200,000 deaths. The United States has the worst numbers by far. So to think about, right, what does controlling COVID mean? How does cooperation work here? It's not just a domestic task, right? But it also depends on a new global culture or reviving that global culture of cooperation. Pandemics don't have borders. So we need to think about how cooperation might respond to pandemics. The idea of placing the US first in this is a gamble. It's based on this idea of winning, right? Well, we can beat this on our own, we can win, we can defeat the virus, using those war metaphors again. But it's a gamble. And that's kind of the scary part. It's a gamble that we're going to win the vaccine race on our own. It's a gamble that the tests are going to be okay. It's a gamble that there's not going to be long-term effects, all of those things. So it's really kind of not a sure bet. But it's really based on the idea of relative gain, right? How can we just serve ourselves, the United States, as opposed to thinking about mutual gains across the world? It also compromises global distribution and mismanagement. It could mean that there's less vaccines to go to other states, and it could thus mean more deaths outside of our borders. The other part is that global inequality and global development demonstrate to us how these shocks affect other countries way more than us. And I know that's really hard to think about because we're all in lockdown, we have masks. I don't know about you guys, but I did not budget some of this stuff in, right, for this year. We are seeing our economy tank. We just saw the stock market decline over the past few days. However you manage it, however you think about well-being, we're seeing that in decline here in the United States, mental health, etc. However, globally, we're looking at undoing about 2.5 decades worth of progress in global development. And this is looking at everything from progress on poverty to progress on maternal health to job creation, et cetera. The pandemic could push another 500 million people into poverty. More than half of the world's population could become impoverished. So impoverished is a higher threshold, but we're looking at already about half the world's population lives on less than $10 a day. So if we're thinking about increasing that, that's a massive, massive number. So this is the last figure that I will leave you with. This is from the World Bank. There's some issues with their poverty numbers, but this gives you a good general trend that pre-COVID, you saw the rate of poverty declining, and this was its projected trend. But now it's going to say that the baseline rate is going to increase like this over time. And if things are at kind of what they're hoping is the worst, as in that it couldn't be worse than that, this would be the rate of poverty after that. So when we think about global cooperation, we obviously have a lot that the United States could benefit from, but these are initiatives in development that the United States has also contributed to in other countries for decades now, and we could be undoing all of that work in the global arena as well. So with that happy thought about the potential of cooperation and the effects of non-cooperation, I welcome your questions, your thoughts, reflections as we wrap up here.
Thank you so much, Ami. Well, if you would like to ask questions through the Q&A, that would be great. And Teresa and I are going to give Ami a hand in facilitating the Q&A, because I imagine there's some questions out there. I did read one that came up in the chat, so we could start with that one, which was, what is the role of the regional WHO offices?
Yeah, so I tried to answer this, but it was kind of pushed in as I was talking about their stuff. Right now that's kind of up for review, and they're trying to reform how the regional offices work. They're trying to think about more global standards, if you will, in terms of what the kind of requirements are for response, but then also thinking about how those regional offices can work more locally and more strongly with kind of community health responses, et cetera. This is something we really saw after 2014 in the response to the Ebola epidemic, this need to really know local systems and to work with community health operators. So one of the things, for example, that's happened is that the World Health Organization now has tried to build this, this kind of cadre, if you will, of community health workers.
Thank you, Ami.
Mm-hmm.
So a question has come in from Evan, and he says he knows it's a big question, but might you briefly talk about the factors driving nationalism and hence a lack of interest in global cooperation on a global stage? So the driving nationalism on a global stage, not just in the US, but Brazil, parts of Europe, and so on.
Right. Yeah. So I'll start with this, that if you're really interested in nationalism, our resident expert on nationalism and global studies is Dr. Peter Grosvenor. So he's the person to go to. I will also say that there's kind of really, really interesting to see that the three kind of strongest nationalist countries right now, which are the United States, India, and Brazil, all kind of have the worst rates of COVID. Right, so this idea of not cooperating and kind of withdrawing has been really, really detrimental. Honestly, I think that Professor Michael Arturn's lecture in 2 weeks on social media and disinformation might be really helpful in thinking about this. I think it's really, really easy to get disinformation about the international arena. It's really hard to know exactly what international organizations are, what institutions are, and how they work. And we often kind of fall prey to these ideas of oh, well, we're doing too much and they're not doing enough, or whatever it might be. There's also then, I think, a lot of fear, right? A lot of fear that things will not be held to ourselves, that we'll lose jobs. It's the same thing that we can talk about in the fear of immigrants, et cetera. So I think those two things right now, disinformation and fear, are really driving factors in nationalism. But again, I would defer to Dr. Grosvenor, who might correct me.
Thank you. We had a question come in through the chat from Aaron, and the question is, liberalism doesn't really promote cooperation as it assumes rational individuals who are naturally competitive and only forced into cooperation. So why focus on liberalism so much?
Right, and this is one of those things that gets tricky, and the transition from liberalism is kind of a theory to liberalism as a very specifically used in international relations, if that makes sense. There's some slippages in the theory and some ways that liberalism is kind of reformed or thought about. So in this case, one of the ways to think about it is that liberalism is thought of as a way of creating a social contract across states, right? So this very kind of traditional idea of liberalism. And it might say that people are or states are naturally competitive to begin with. But in international relations theory, there's a huge discussion about incentives and those incentives changing over time. In other words, as the system progresses and as there's more liberal states and kind of a more general normed approach, the incentives actually become greater to kind of embrace this trend of liberalism and cooperation than they are to be cooperative, right? So it's trying to like displace that idea, or sorry, to be competitive. It's trying to displace the idea of competitiveness by creating incentives other ways, right? But yeah, there are definitely slippages in how the theory is transformed and applied.
We have a couple of questions related to WHO funding. So first, Kathy is asking who decides the US donations to who, what's the process? And then Patty is asking, when Trump backed away from whose support, what was the impact on the organization?
Right, so, okay, the US donations to who, the parts that are the actual voluntary donations, those are through regular congressional budgeting processes, right? So they're part of the US national budget. They're parts that Congress has to go through and pass and approve. So yeah, the president actually doesn't have the full power to completely remove funding. That's really, really important. So Trump has said that he's backing away from WHO support and that he's withdrawing. We actually haven't done that yet, right? We can't just suddenly decide to do that and back away. There's a whole process to go through. But what we can do, right, is we can, in terms of what this president can do, is he can influence Congress to not pass further funding, and he can essentially ignore the World Health Organization, right? And he can play politics with them. So we're not going to give you access to get our data in order to share and organize. We're not going to play with you nicely in doing this vaccine creation, et cetera. So the kind of full implications are not very clear yet, but there's huge concerns right now that it's going to mess up vaccine creation, right? Because it's the question of, are you going to do this jointly WHO-led vaccine creation that's not necessarily about profit, right? But it's more about the kind of global good, or so there's concerns about that, and then there's concerns that that will really mess up distribution of vaccines, and that last part is probably the most critical. Well, actually both, they're tied, right? So.
And I guess a final question is coming from Kenny. You know, to me, it's sort of a question about hope. I'm thinking of the Paris Accord as well, and the fact that there's a timeline on that, on the US pulling out of that as well. But the question is there a deadline for joining COVAX? And if Biden is elected, can the US still join?
Yes, yeah. States are announcing that they're joining. It's increased. It was first announced like in September, and it's increased a lot just in the past 6-7 weeks. There's also kind of new things coming out, right? So the Western States Pact here in the United States, Washington, Oregon, Nevada, and California have all agreed that they're going to do their own vaccine kind of checks before deploying them in our states, right? So there's all sorts of new things happening constantly that are pushing for cooperation in light of this potential withdrawal. So yes, maintain hope.
Thank you so much, Ami. We're at time now, and I'm going to hand it over to Teresa to let us know what's happening next week. Thank you so much. It was really an informative and delightful lecture. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Shah. So next week, we continue exploring social scientific perspectives, and we will have a lecture by Drs. Michelle Saynar and Corey Cook, who are both professors of psychology, and they will be talking to us about why it's so difficult to get people to follow health directives. So the title of the talk, it's like herding chickens: social psychology and the understanding of non-compliance with pandemic health directives. So we look forward to seeing you all back here next week. And Dr. Shah, again, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ami, and to all of you who are here. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.